Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and we are continuing our study of Matthew chapter 25, 31, and following. Now, remember, this is all part and parcel of our overall study of the Olivet Discourse in demonstrating that the Olivet Discourse is not divided into two different subjects. I was raised believing, I taught it for years, that the Olivet Discourse, Matthew chapter 24, 1 through 34, or maybe 1 through 35, but generally 1 through 34, was talking about the Lord's coming and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. But beginning with verse 35 or verse 36, and 36 is the general cutoff point where Jesus said, "But of that day and hour knows no man." By the way, Holger Neubauer has a brand new book out entitled, "But of that day and hour." I would suggest that you get a copy of that book. He's done a real good job examining that language and showing that it's not a contrast, it's not a break in subject, it is a continuation. Simply saying, they could know the generation, to be sure. It was their generation, but they could not know the specific day and the hour of the Lord's coming. So, anyway, Holger Neubauer, his book, "But of that day and hour," or "Of that day and hour." So, anyway, we are continuing our examination of Isaiah chapter 2 through 4 based upon the following concept, the following premise that virtually no one denies. Matthew 25, 31 and following is about the last days, day of the Lord. Okay? Now that means it's 2 Peter chapter 3. But it also means it's Isaiah chapters 2 through 4, because Isaiah 2 through 4 is all about the last days, Isaiah 2, verses 2 and following, and it's about the day of the Lord, Isaiah 2:12. The day of the Lord, when men could run to the hills, hide in the rocks and the caves, which cannot be an end of time, earth burning, or even earth renovating event. It's not an end of history event. You know, folks, I was raised believing that there's one day of the Lord. When I began to realize that the New Testament writers tell us over and over and over again that they're looking for the day of the Lord foretold by the Old Testament prophets, I began to go, well, okay, if the New Testament writers were looking for the day of the Lord that was foretold by the Old Testament prophets, then I need to go to the Old Testament and examine the Old Testament predictions of the last days, day of the Lord. It was life-changing. It exposed my utter ignorance of the Old Testament. It exposed my utter ignorance of the language of the day of the Lord as used in the Old Testament. I mean, it literally changed my life. I came to realize and to see the Bible is not written in some woodenly literalistic manner when it describes the day of the Lord. Instead, it's highly metaphoric, highly apocalyptic, highly hyperbolic. And it is a challenge for Western-oriented people to grasp that. Okay, so with that said, now, I'll be coming back quite extensively, okay, to the language of Isaiah chapter 2, 10 to 12, verses 19 to 21 in our future examination. But I want us to examine even further the nature of the day of the Lord that Isaiah chapter 2 is describing. So let's go to chapter 3. Now remember, Isaiah chapters 2 through 4 is one united discourse. There, you have absolutely zero justification for inserting 2,000 or 3,000 year gaps in the periods of at the end of certain verses. It's just not justified. The grammar does not justify it. The only thing that would, quote, justify it is a preconceived idea that, well, okay, I can see this is true here, but this has got to be the end of time. Next verse. And so, I had a formal public debate years and years ago with a gentleman, an amillennialist. He literally had no concept of the nature of the day of the Lord in Isaiah 2 through 4. He believed that the term last days refers to the Christian age, as 99.9% of all amillennialists do. When I got up with chart after chart after chart, demonstrating that Isaiah chapter 2 through 4 is a united discourse describing the last days, day of the Lord, he was honest enough to say in the Q&A session, I don't know how to answer that. I've got to go back home and I've got to study. Okay, so how does Isaiah chapters 2 through 4, in addition to what it says in verses 10 through 12, 19 to 21, about being the time in which man could flee to the mountains, how does it describe this day of the Lord? Well, chapter 3, verse 1 and following. For behold, the Lord of hosts takes away from Jerusalem and from Judah the stock and the store, the whole supply of bread and the whole supply of water. The mighty man and the man of war, the judge and the prophet, the diviner and the elder, the man of, or the captain of 50, and the honorable man, the counselor and the skillful artisan, and the expert enchanter. I will give children to be their princes. Babies shall rule over them. The people will be oppressed for everyone by another, and everyone by his neighbor. The child will be insolent toward the elder, and the base toward honorable. Point number 1. Who is this last day's day of the Lord against? It's against Jerusalem. Now, are you going to say that's the New Jerusalem? Well, it never says it. And if you're going to say that this is the New Jerusalem, then you're going to have to explain the utter corruption, the utter sinfulness, the utter abominations that this Jerusalem being described in Isaiah chapter 3 would fit the last days, quote, New Jerusalem. Are you willing to do that? Well, let's see. When a man takes hold of his brother in the house of his father, saying, you have clothing, you be our ruler, and let these ruins be upon, or be under your power. Wait a minute, what ruins? Oh, Jerusalem. So here we have the last day's day of the Lord against Jerusalem, in which Jerusalem is in ruins. Is that the church? Is that the New Jerusalem? No, you know it's not. In that day, the day of the Lord against Jerusalem, in that day he will protest, saying, in other words, a man says to his brother and says, here, you rule over these ruins. Because you see, there aren't many men left. In that day, when his brothers take hold of him and say, okay, rule over us, rule over these ruins, he will protest, saying, I cannot cure your ills, for in my house is neither food nor clothing. Do not make me a ruler of the people. A time of famine. In the last days, day of the Lord against Jerusalem, it would be a day of famine when the Lord would take away the entire stock of bread and water. And a man say, I can't rule over everybody. I don't have any food. For, this is causative, for Jerusalem stumbled, Judah is fallen. I don't think we have Jerusalem and Judah in the new heaven, new earth, do we? For Jerusalem stumbled, Judah is fallen, because their tongue and their doings are against the Lord, to provoke the eyes of the Lord. New Jerusalem provoke the eyes of the Lord? No. The look of their countenance witnesses against them. They declare their sin as Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to their soul, for they have brought evil upon themselves. Folks, this is Old Covenant Jerusalem in the last days. Wait a minute. In Revelation chapter 11, we find the prediction of the destruction of Babylon, otherwise known, spiritually designated as Sodom. And here in Isaiah chapter 3 is the prediction that in the last days, Jerusalem would be like Sodom. They declare their sin like Sodom. Now, by the way, in Isaiah chapter 1, the writer Yahweh just simply describes Jerusalem as Sodom. Even in Isaiah's day. Is it any wonder that John in Revelation, that the Lord could refer to Jerusalem of the first century as Sodom? Okay, now watch this. Got to continue. Verse 10. Say to the righteous, it shall be well with them, for they shall eat the fruit of their doings. Woe to the wicked, it shall be ill with them, for the reward of his hand shall be given him. As for my people, children are their oppressors, women rule over them. O my people, those who lead you cause you to err and destroy the way of your past. The Lord stands up to plead and stands to judge the people. The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders of his people and his princes, for you have eaten up the vineyard. Well, what's the vineyard of the Lord? Chapter 5 of Isaiah tells us the vineyard of the Lord was Israel. Oh, and do you remember Matthew chapter 21? Jesus telling the parable of the wicked husbandman given charge over the vineyard of the Lord. But because of their wickedness, their cruelty, their violence, even against the son, the Lord said he would come, that's the day of the Lord, and destroy those wicked men, take the kingdom from Israel and give it to another nation. Matthew 21, 40 to 43. Now, we're not through describing the last days, day of the Lord. But what have we seen this morning? The last days, day of the Lord is against Jerusalem. Isaiah 3, verse 1. It is a time of famine, no food, no bread, no water. It is a time when children, when babies, graphic language, hyperbolic language, not literally infants, would rule over them. The point being, those who were not leaders would have to be their leaders. It is the time in which the Lord would stand up to plead his people. Don't you find it interesting, by the way, in Acts chapter 17, verse 55, that Stephen, as he's being stoned, looks up and he sees Jesus standing, not sitting, standing at the right hand of the Majesty. Wonder what that meant. He was going to judge those wicked rulers. That's what that meant. So here we have in Isaiah chapter 3, a prediction of the last days, the day of the Lord, a time of famine, a time when there'd be no bread, no water, when the Lord would stand up to judge his people because they had become like Sodom. And that was first century, Old Covenant Jerusalem. It's not talking about an earth burning, time ending, or earth renovating day of the Lord. Now remember, the day of the Lord of 2 Peter chapter 3 is the last days, day of the Lord, foretold by the Old Testament prophets. How is that not Isaiah? So, I'm out of time, but Isaiah 2 through 4, last days, day of the Lord, when the Lord would rise to shake the earth mightily. To shake the earth means to remove and destroy the earth. But the last days, day of the Lord would be the judgment of Jerusalem and Israel, when they would become like Sodom. 2 Peter chapter 3, the last days, day of the Lord, when the Lord would come to destroy heaven and earth because of the ungodliness of the people. That means 2 Peter chapter 3, unless you can prove it's a different day of the Lord, of the last days, foretold by the Old Testament prophets. That means 2 Peter chapter 3 is a prediction of the day of the Lord against Jerusalem in AD 70. And I'm totally out of time. Do yourself a favor. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. Order my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, or The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, or Like Father, Like Son on Clouds of Glory, in which I discuss all of these connections extensively. Okay? Thanks again for joining me. I'll see you on the flip side.